Hey, welcome to the Unknown Wires podcast, the very first one. Before I get into it, I just thought it would be nice if I talk about what this is all about. So, I'm in the tech space. I like reading books, learning stuff, and have certain opinion on certain things. And I just thought it would be nice if I shared it with other people. So, that's the inception of this podcast. I'll be discussing a lot of things, but probably most commonly is going to be books, the books I've read, and mainly technical books. But once in a while, is going to be some book which is out of the field. I might bring guests over, which I'm really excited to do because I have a lot of friends who are doing their PhDs or are working in some really different domains than me, but I find it interesting. So you're going to find some linguists and psychologists as well who show up. But all that aside, this particular podcast is going to talk about the book called The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim, George Spafford, and Kevin Burr. I just hope I pronounced their names correctly. So, this book was a recommendation by a friend of mine. It's about a fictional company which has to change its IT processes to turn profit and ensure that its new project called the Phoenix Project has or enters the market and makes money. And they have strong competition. They have, I think, 6 months to deliver something. I don't remember the exact detail on the timeline. But the thing is, it's a very interesting book. And it's interesting because it talks about so many things that I've experienced working for a very large company. And interestingly, having read this book, say, had I read this book before when I was working at a startup, I would have thought, man, all this is unbelievable. It's extreme fantasy and never happens. But turns out it actually happens, especially in very large organizations, and it happens beat to beat. So I feel many people will benefit from it, and there are so many lessons here. So I'm really excited to get started. Again, like I mentioned, there are going to be a lot of spoilers. So if you haven't read this book and would like to read the book, maybe just come back later. But at the same time, I'm not going to discuss the entire book, of course. And again, I'm going to encourage you to pick it up and read it. But I'm going to talk about some important points, or at least the points I think are important or were more relevant to me. And these are the things I have highlighted. And I'm going to read them out, and I'm going to also just give my opinion on these things. So this book follows this guy, Bill Palmer, who has made the VP of IT operations. And actually, bit of a sidetrack here, but that's my main criticism of this book. Again, it's going to sound very petty when I say it, but I still feel, I mean, it's not relatable. For many companies, it's not relatable. So the thing is, this guy, Bill Palmer, he's an ex-Marine. So of course he's going to come and change stuff because these guys, they're taught leadership. They're taught leadership in probably the best leadership school, I would say, that is the military. Of course, it's not just Marines, but all militaries everywhere else. But because the problem with real life is that many managers, they are not taught leadership, and it's a fallacy to think that leaders are born. They're not. You have to put them in situations and see how they react. You have to teach them to be calm. And what happens in many companies is that a lot of managers, their ego gets in the way, and that sort of spoils the dynamics. They have favorites. At the same time, many of them, they can't delegate. So some managers, they like to be involved in a bunch of stuff. So they micromanage, which is not nice. Ideally, you should leave the ownership of a product to the people who are working on it. That way, they also take the ownership of all the mistakes that's there, And they also take extra initiative because that's their baby basically. And the manager's job is to keep everyone on track. And the other problem that comes when having a very micromanaging manager is that they feel the pressure, and because they feel the pressure, they sort of make the employees feel it as well. Not directly, but indirectly it's conveyed. And that's not good because stress for a long time is bad. And the thing about companies are, of course, everything has a deadline. And you will always be fighting fires. So, ideally, a manager who can remain calm and then convey this calmness through his or her attitude to their team is more useful to the team. But again, I digress. I just wanted to read this passage because I felt like it feels so familiar. And this guy, Bill Palmer, he's talking about his bosses, CIOs, Chief Information Officers. So he says, I didn't see this coming. There wasn't any chatter on the subspace radio, nothing. For the last decade, like clockwork, new CIOs would come and go every 2 years. They stayed just long enough to understand the acronyms, learn where the bathrooms are, implement a bunch of programs and initiatives to upset the apple cart, and then they're gone. Again, I don't know if you guys find it funny, but I just found it funny given my experience that every time a new project comes up, there's a new acronym. And and with the rate at which people stay in a team in a lot of these tech companies, just 2 years, it's just a mess. Some companies have internal wikis maintained by employees to take care of all the acronyms, or at least update all the acronyms. Again, I digress, but I just wanted to start with this. Another thing that this book really emphasizes on is communication, and communication between teams, within teams, and across teams, and how important that is. And I've seen how in large companies, because they don't have proper communication structures, that there are so many teams that are actually working on super similar projects. And that's just waste of resources, right? You're paying all these engineers. At the same time, there is internal competition because these products have to succeed to justify the time and money spent on it. And what happens is some teams copy features from some other teams, or because they're building competing products, they don't really align forces. And even with debugging, what happens is the problem with microservices is, so what people have done is taken the original concept of being able to deploy stuff independently. They've taken that and used it to fragment teams in such a manner that these teams don't even interact with each other. So you have one single product which you break it down into 100 different components, and all of these then operate in very complex ways. And if you don't have proper communication structure, then debugging becomes important, because what happens is you have, for example, say you have one algorithm team which is making some algorithm, and some other team ends up taking that code, putting it in a container, attaching some code that interacts with Kubernetes, and has some sort of maybe another execution layer on top, which takes the trained algorithms. Say take the example of machine learning models, where you can train models on a Kubernetes pod, and then when you get those trained models, you can then deploy them. And for fast inference, generally C++ is used, but say you have a different team that's working on it. So since the product becomes fragmented, if something fails, then the question becomes, who is responsible for it? Is it the algorithm team, or is it the inference team, because they're the ones who built the layer on top which takes the model and performs inference, because maybe that's where there is a point of failure? Or is it the platform team? Maybe they installed the wrong dependency, or maybe they compiled with incorrect flags. And again, this is one pitfall which people need to address. And a lot of people, they might, who don't have experience in such similar projects, might think, hey, this is not possible. But trust me, it happens. And it's very interesting to see that this book actually uh, identifies it, points to it, and basically calls it out in, of course, the fictional setting, and then lays down processes to solve it. And one of this is the change management process that is introduced. So whenever someone wants to make a change, that is like upgrading the database version or doing some security patch, they should basically submit it for review rather than going on their own. And the right stakeholders have to be involved, and the change should be communicated to them. Otherwise, stuff fails silently. And I have noticed what happens is, if you don't have proper communication, or if certain team members are excluded from, say, certain decision processes, later on when something fails, the people who are tasked to fix it have no idea where exactly the issue occurs. So, in the starting of this book, it actually says that, this guy, he mentions his two colleagues that are with him. So I think one of them is Patty, who is the director of IT service support, and Wes, who is the director of distributed technology operations. Again, it does not matter exactly what their roles are for this discussion, but the thing is, they are his two go-to managers, and sort of who are by his side throughout. And they have, or they organize these meetings, weekly meetings, where they get everyone from every different team, and where they just discuss changes. So that's something that's super necessary. But I feel is, whatever happens or whatever communication takes place between the managers, it should also be propagated forward, which of course does not happen all the time. But I'm going to read out a passage from the book, which I feel highlights the debugging challenges, or certain challenges which a lot of us developers face when dealing with some issues. So it says, when something hits the fan, you need all various stakeholders and technology managers to communicate and coordinate until the problem is resolved. And that's the thing. What I've noticed, at least especially with all these remote work, is that you can't just walk up to people or just have an ad hoc meeting, because generally the friction to have meetings with people is higher, especially when they're cross teams, than just pulling people over when they're in the office. Because over time in the office, even if people are from different teams, you end up building better rapport. And that's one of my primary arguments for people working in the office. But again, I can understand for a lot of different reasons that people would want to work at home. So we still need to, as technology, or at least people in tech, we need to figure this out. How do we kind of achieve parity with that? But what I was getting at was, there have been issues where basically a ticket has been assigned which says, hey, this particular thing is not working. And then basically the task is to go figure what caused it. And because you don't know what happened throughout, especially because if you have a large fragmented project with a lot of microservices and different repositories, you can't really keep an eye on everything. And so my approach generally has been to open all these repositories up and just track Git changes from at least in the areas which I feel are relevant to my task. And I think what's nice is the git blame feature, which you can also see that if you have not touched it, so someone else might have touched it. So you can also use that to narrow it down. And I don't think it's ideal. I don't know what's the solution for this, because what many companies are doing, they're maintaining a mono repository, which again I feel is a terrible idea, because then you just have maybe 6 GB of repository that you have to download, which is insane. And then what some other companies have done is they have used this fancy engineering with Kubernetes and cloud computing to actually set up all your development machine online. And because with VS Code, at least as of time of recording this podcast, you know, it's the most popular IDE. It supports remote development, so it gives you access to a container which your VS Code can attach to. And I don't think that's the best approach. I think the best approach is you simplify stuff, and actually, to simplify stuff, they also give another great analogy, and a lot of analogy that is taken from manufacturing. So, which is, how do you control the release of work? Then, if you really want to make, like, the way in manufacturing, how it works is, if you want to, so ideally to make profit or to drive out competition, you have to make stuff which is cheaper than what the competition is selling, right? So how do you make stuff cheaper? Of course, it would mean having good or better contracts so that your inventory that's coming in itself is cheaper. But the other option, what you can do is actually make all your processes, say, shorter, maybe remove or eliminate redundant or unnecessary steps, and try to save on as many steps as possible. And when you release work, at least in manufacturing, you have to find out where exactly is the bottleneck. So in this book, they give an example of this plant where I think there is some heating or painting process which takes time, because I think the paint has to dry, and I guess the heating depends on the furnace. So based on how much that particular element can handle, you have to release work. And in this book, what they find is that there's this one guy called Brent, who is basically like the go-to guy for everyone. Everyone is able to directly reach to him. So basically send a message and like, hey, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? And because he's overtasked, and especially when a critical issue comes, he has to drop everything else and then work on that. It creates a lot of backlog. And what they also find is that he does not really document steps, and which again is a problem, because you can't do knowledge transfer to other people. So people who can help reduce this work. And what they do then is, because they find out like, okay, this guy is the one who is kind of the bottleneck, they try to ensure that the work that's released is something that he can handle. And they put safeguards from, at least for people to directly contact him. And you'd be surprised how frequently this happens, because right now with Teams, I feel like I can go on a big criticism for Microsoft Teams, but it's not just Microsoft Teams, right? Because it's Slack as well. But the thing is, first, anyone can send you a message. So say you're working on a product, and someone from the marketing team can, because they know you're the one working on the product, they can directly send you a message to help with some code that they want to demo. And of course, you should help your team, because your marketing team or that person is someone from your company, right? And also you both have the same goal, that is to not only create the best product but also deliver it to people, right? Like, what's the point of creating like the most beautiful art when you can't show it to anyone? So yes, you should help anyone who reaches out to you. At the same time, it should not be that easy for anyone to reach out to you, so that, because it might actually throw you off your tracks, because when you make your plans, say for the quarter, or these days many companies, they're following this OKR, which is objective key results, So I think there's a very famous video where this one guy, he explains it, and how Sundar Pichai, when he was still managing Chrome, I guess his goal was to hit, like his key results was to hit certain number of Chrome downloads. But anyway, what happens is when you set all these goals, you don't factor in all unplanned work, as actually what this book calls, right? So when you don't or when you don't factor in unplanned work, then you make up some goals that are easily thrown away, right? And it talks about a couple of different types of work. So it says unplanned, then of course the planned ones, but then also IT maintenance. I will go over them later, and I have a feeling I might revisit parts of this book in different podcasts. But at least for now, what I want to say is that people should not, like, you got to understand where your bottleneck is, right? And you have to eliminate that particular bottleneck. And actually, in the case of Brent, I feel like I'm digressing from my actual point, but something that came to my mind, which actually picked up. I used to do it in some forms in digital manner. So I use Obsidian. I love Obsidian, and you can have daily notes. And that's where I sort of logged everything that I did. So be it your steps for debugging something, and meeting notes for that day, or just the to do for that day, or answering anything. And because you can connect notes in Obsidian, that's where sort of my knowledge base stays. But in the book, Pragmatic Programmer, which I'm going to talk about in the next podcast, they actually mention having an engineering daybook. And that was because one of the authors, he was in an engineering company, or he visited a company where everyone carried these notebooks around and they wrote down everything. So from readings of instruments to meetings and all. And they had a competition on filling as many books as possible. And they used to write the date. And I feel it's super important. I feel I can again make a very different podcast on my criticisms for the way we do computer engineering, because you got to understand, like, our field, like while we are called programmers, our field of computer science and computer engineering, it came from sciences, it came from Department of Mathematics, of electrical engineering, right? And over time, we have just forgotten a lot of these scientific processes. We have forgotten a lot of these processes to log stuff. And what we don't understand is, say we leave the company, right? How are we going to transfer that knowledge? And if you have it in one place, maybe a digital folder with Obsidian, or maybe some notebooks, you can just hand it over to someone else. And I've heard this from colleagues who know people from other company, who talk about the fact that when veterans who have been in the company for 20 years, 23 years, when they leave the company, people basically walk around with a tape recorder just to and ask them a bunch of questions just to write it down, because a lot of times these people, they know how to solve a problem, but they don't write it down. It just comes by experience. And next time when someone comes across this, they're lost, right? And there is this very famous story of missing screw in I think in F14. And yeah, maybe it's relevant, so I'm going to narrate it. But of course, my narration is not going to be as amazing as the original article I read. But the brief story is basically people who maintain or were servicing F14, I think, or F16. I'm just going to call it F16 for now. They found a loose screw, or basically a screw on the ground. And because it's such a complex system, because there are so many teams working on it, one single person does not know about everything, right? And so what happens is, these guys just start asking around, right? And the officer on the ground, he does not want to, he can't say to his top boss that, hey, I don't know what the screw is, like, what's up with the screw? Like, where is it from? And neither does the top boss, right? Those generals at the top. So it's a big it's a big nightmare for everyone involved across the chain of hierarchy and across different teams who are working on it. And no one has any idea, right? Because people are talking to each other, the computer folks and people from who are assuming the ordnance, and I guess, yeah, I don't know in details how many different teams are involved. But so what they do is they end up talking to this old guy who's there. I think he's retired, but he's reemployed, something like that, who's in the corner, like, and they ask him like, hey, because finally someone thought after so much time like, hey, why don't I just ask this guy? And they asked him, and he said, oh, don't worry about it. Basically, there was this hole which I think had some equipment, but they don't need it anymore, so they just put a screw there to just plug the hole. So it's basically nothing. And what this story highlights is how much of knowledge that is lost over time just because of changes and just because of improper communication or just writing stuff down, right? Usually teams have to maintain handover documents, but it's a pain because what happens is people have to, like, it's an additional task which people do. It's not part of their daily habits. And what I feel what people should do is actually make it part of their daily habit. So if this service a particular server, they should write it down in their own notes. So that first, I'm a big fan of digital notes compared to a physical daybook, as it's searchable, right? It gets indexed and you can search for it. And once you do that, once you have it, have the steps, you can share it with people. I mean, you can just copy the document, polish it a bit, and share it with someone else. So that's probably a very big digression, but those are my thoughts about change management and how it's handled and how communication should be. So I think a lot of us in software engineering would probably be aware of the Conway's law, which states that the software is a reflection of the internal communication structure. And that's basically what happens when you don't have proper communication, or if you have so many different teams that don't really interact with each other, and when people don't know what's happening between teams, you get a very fragmented software, which again is a burden to maintain and is challenging to service and upgrade, and also for basically new engineers to come in and take reins, right? So that's my thoughts. Let's move on to the next topic. So another thing that I've highlighted is this phrase with practice calm. So this is phrase which the main character Bill, he, before he's about to say something, this is where it's interjected. And what's happening is Patty is talking about the amount of problems that they have, and then he also internally feels the panic, or at least feels the gravity of it. But he just says, with practice calm, I say, okay, knowing is always better than not knowing. Keep going, right? And this is super important. It's actually for everyone, and just carry it everywhere in life. I feel it's not relevant specifically to any project or anything. What's important here is, if you're overwhelmed or if you're emotional, and if in that state we're not calm, and when we talk to people, or just talk to someone with urgency, right? Or maybe increase your pitch, or maybe add some sorrowness to it, and you'll see that that emotion is translated or sort of transmitted to the other person. It's conveyed not in your words, but how you say it. And when you're working with a team, it's super important, especially there are times when you have hard deadline, when sometimes you might have to work hard, or sometimes you feel like something didn't work, some things got stretched, and the plan is run off course. And if you're frustrated, if you feel overwhelmed, and you feel let that show, that's infectious to your fellow colleagues. And so this character with I feel like this phrase with practice calm is also super important because it says practice calm, right? It does not say calm. So which also shows that yeah, of course it's not natural. It's if you feel overwhelmed, first it's human, right? If you're afraid, like that's a natural human mechanism of survival, right? But after that first initial movement, like moment of fear, how you respond after that is more important. So if you're, I mean, starting your career and maybe you're overwhelmed, and that's basically what happens, right? If you're starting your career, a lot is expected from you. A lot of people, for better or worse reasons, give you a lot more tasks. And at least in most tech companies, personal time is not the case, right? So you might feel overwhelmed, you might feel stressed. But I feel like this is also a very good opportunity to learn how to be calm, work on your breath work. And especially working from home, you can actually disengage by stepping, just getting up from your desk, stepping away from it, and maybe just walking around a bit, like pace around, maybe put some books back in the shelves or do something, detach. Because first, to become calm, you might have to go through all these steps. But later on, with enough practice, whenever some news upsets you or changes your emotional state, you will immediately be able to count on this practice calm to kick in, to respond with, all right, how do we go about it? Or, okay, so this seems overwhelming or intimidating. So, how do I break it down? And is it realistic? And if it's not realistic, maybe convey it upright. At the same time, not giving up on it completely, right? Once you break it down, you're like, okay, I can do this, this, this. How about I go do this, this, this? And say, like, listen, these are the steps I was able to achieve in this particular time. And these are the steps that are remaining, but I have confidence that I'll be able to do it at this particular time. And first, if you're calm, and especially if you show intent, then generally you don't get that much pushback. Because what happens is, with your non-verbal communication, actually it's verbal in this case, but sort of subtext here that's conveyed to your manager or anyone is, you know what, this guy is on top of it, and I'm going to leave it to his judgment. But if you're like, oh, this can't be done, or if you don't say anything, especially in a lot of cultures, work cultures, people don't really say anything to their bosses, and they fume internally. I don't think it's nice, but at the same time, if you're able to remain calm and convey your the potential challenges that might arise or your concerns, and then say, but you know what, this is what I'm going to do, or this is how I'm going to approach. But keep in mind that based on this particular calculation of my approach, this is how it's going to come out, or this is where we might be by Friday evening, right? So again, I feel a very important gem that's sort of peppered in somewhere, which, very, very interesting phrasing, right? So I'm going to end the podcast at this stage. Not a very long one, but there are a couple of analogies from manufacturing and a lot of these terms that are used or taught in during your MBA that I want to touch upon, but I'm also, at least I want to talk about Chip Wars, another great book. And it's about physical manufacturing, right? So in that book, there are so many processes that are outlined on how they were able to make the chips cheaper. And in this book, Pragmatic Programmer, they use the analogy of manufacturing to show how similar it is to IT operations. So I feel that's a whole different topic in itself, and it would be nice to discuss it not in context of a single book, but by collecting all these different analogies. Because again, like I said, it's actually nice if we as computer programmers go back and read a lot of literature that is available in other engineering, because I feel we do make very similar mistakes, and it's not original mistakes, right? If other engineering fields have already corrected those or have seen them like ages ago and have put in procedures, operating procedures to solve those or mitigate those or avoid those completely, then we should actually drop on that. We should make it a more disciplined field of approach. And I know a lot of you do have super disciplined approach, because I know so many people who maintain daily logs, have a physical notebook and in front of them, or who continuously even uh, read all these technical books. So which is nice, again, probably topic of the next podcast. But the discipline in our field is probably what's required. So change management in this book is, I think it one line captures it super well. That is this line: to capture change, you require three pieces of information. That's who is planning the change, the system being changed, and one sentence summary. And in large systems, when you have, say, a platform, well, not platform, but the infrastructure, the core infrastructure, that is your Kubernetes, like Helm charts or Docker Compose files. And if someone, say, changes the way these interact, and if other teams are not aware, then some of their assumptions might break, and that might break the whole code. And if these changes are communicated to each team, it's going to be super useful for the team. The other line, which going back to what I talked about not being directly available, is basically the main guy, Bill. He tells Brent, the other guy who is always inundated with tasks, he says, do whatever it takes to break people of the habit of going directly to you. You've got my permission to turn off your phone ringer and change your voicemail greeting to say you are not available and contact Wes instead. So Wes is the other manager. Whatever it takes, right? And what's nice, actually, what I found quite annoying about Teams was, because you have to keep it on all the time so that your team can reach you if they want, or there's some way to communicate. At the same time, it's so distracting because you're like 100 channels and it keeps pinging you. It now has this focus mode, so people are aware that, hey, you're focusing, so your notifications might not get pushed through, which is nice. What I do is also just turn off email, because if it's important, someone will shoot me a text on Teams. And at the same time, I feel most of us don't have this super high time critical job, right? None of us, at least in IT, if you're in IT who is listening, we're not ER, we're not first response. So ideally, people aren't supposed to reach us directly anyways. And if you always have to respond to messages because you're task switching, it's also exhausting first because your brain, it has to keep changing context, but you can't do deep work. And our job requires that you spend a lot of time thinking. You have to, there are so many pieces of code that you have to hold in mind. And this is why I find this line as well, or this takeaway to that, basically to that engineer, what's being said is, hey, be unreachable. And if you've read Deep Work, I'm a big fan of that book, but it actually talks about this. It talks about people who go to extreme lengths as well to not be interrupted. You don't have to do that in a job because collaboration is super important, and we forget as programmers that we don't code in isolation. I know many of us got into this field because we like coding, because we like the solitude of our own thoughts when creating something that we have in mind, and because it's our idea, we get super annoyed if someone encroaches upon it. That is, if you have an idea on how code should be, and if someone else has a different idea, you take it super personally. So those are the other habits that need to be changed. Again, I feel like whole different podcasts. But since this is the first podcast episode and there are so many things I want to talk about, so I think it's peppered everywhere, this podcast. And maybe in the future it will become more focused, because then I will try to channel whatever I want to say. But before ending this, maybe I'll just leave with one quote that's there in the book, which says, improving daily work is even more important than doing daily work. And I leave that as a thought for you guys to think about. See you in the next one.